You think you can outrun your ghosts? On a dead rock spinning through the void, they're the only damn company you have. For Jake Reeves, his ghosts were 63 souls adrift in the cold vacuum of space, a constant chilling reminder of the day his genius failed. Guilt has a taste. For 3 years, it had tasted like recycled water and the metallic tang of the endless dust on the planet Aritus. He had sentenced himself to this scorched wasteland, a self-imposed exile where the only rule was simple: survive alone. Trust no one. Never again be responsible for another life. He was crouched in the flickering shade of his compound's perimeter fence, pulse rifle cradled in his arms, the heat-warped horizon a shimmering hellscape. He was hunting water pirates, or so he told himself. In reality, he was just waiting to die. Then he saw them. Not pirates, something worse. Ghosts made real. 3 figures, staggering through the heat shimmer, collapsing in the blood-red sand less than 100 meters from his gate. 2 were small, frail, 1 larger, moving with a desperate, agonizing slowness. Jake's finger tightened on the trigger guard. A reflex. His brain screamed at him. Not your problem. Let the desert take them. It's what the desert does. He'd learned the price of getting involved. 63 ghosts whispered it to him on the wind. The larger figure dragged herself forward on trembling limbs. The sun glinted off something strange. Iridescent fur matted with dust and what looked like dried blood. Felinar. The 2 smaller shapes were cubs, their tiny bodies spasming in the sand, their whimpering cries like razors against Jake's frayed nerves. The mother's head lifted. Through the gate's advanced sensor grid, her golden eyes locked onto his. And in that gaze, Jake saw it. Not a plea for help. It was an accusation. A parent's dying, desperate rage at a universe that would let her children perish. It shattered every wall of guilt and isolation he had so carefully constructed. She collapsed, face first, into the burning sand, a mere 10 meters from a salvation she would never reach. Jake was moving before his mind could veto the action. His carefully maintained solitude be damned. The pulse rifle clattered against the compound wall as he slammed the gate release, sprinting out into the killing heat that felt like stepping into a furnace. The cubs, Kes and Mira, he would later learn, were barely breathing. Their spotted fur was dull, their tiny mouths agape. Their mother, Shy, had used her last ounce of strength not to save herself but to shield them with her body. The elegant robes she wore, now shredded rags, spoke of a life far from this desolate hell. He hooked his arms under her shoulders and dragged. 70 kilos of dead weight, the sand burning through the synthetic weave of his gloves. The cubs came next, 1 under each arm, their bodies as hot as engine coils. Every instinct, every ghost from his past, shrieked that this was a mistake. He was taking responsibility. He was setting himself up for another failure, another round of graves to dig in his soul. But the faint, ragged breaths of the cubs against his chest and the image of those golden eyes drowned out the warnings. Inside the cool, metallic confines of his workshop, the man who had buried the soldier and the engineer resurrected himself. Emergency medical training took over with cold precision. He laid them on the floor, his hands already moving for his emergency water reserves. 2 full months of life support, in a world where a single liter was worth more than a man's life. He started with the mother. Tilting her head back, he pried open her jaw, the blue tinge of her lips a stark sign of advanced dehydration. He let the precious life-giving water trickle past her fangs. Her throat convulsed. She swallowed. He moved to the cubs, using a nutrient dropper to carefully place single, patient drops into their tiny mouths. For 6 agonizing hours, Jake Reeves, the man who had sworn off all attachment, became a guardian angel. He monitored their vitals, adjusted cooling packs, and rationed his future into their failing bodies with the obsessive focus of a man desperate to rewrite his own history. He burned through a quarter of his entire supply. If the pirates came now, if his automated surveyor contract was terminated, He'd be the one turning to dust in 2 weeks. It didn't matter. As the binary suns of Aritus bled across the sky, casting long crimson shadows, the larger cub, Kess, opened his eyes. They were golden like his mother's, but clear, filled with a confused fear that slowly melted into a profound wonder as they focused on Jake's scarred face. The cub made a sound, a soft mixture of a chirp and a purr, and reached out with a tiny, hesitant paw to touch Jake's hand. In that moment, something deep inside Jake's chest, a thing he'd thought long dead and buried under 3 years of regret, stirred. An hour later, Shi's eyes snapped open. They held the fire of Aritus's suns, set in a face that was both distinctly alien and achingly, regally beautiful. Her gaze darted first to her cubs, who were now curled up against Jake's side, their breathing deep and steady. Only then did she look at him. Jake saw the moment her mind processed everything. His worn surveyor's gear, the Spartan, functional compound, the stack of half-empty water containers. She understood the sacrifice. You. Her voice was a dry rasp, her command of human standard rough but clear. You gave us your water. Jake just shrugged, the intensity of her stare making him deeply uncomfortable. Couldn't just let you die on my doorstep. Bad for property values. But Shia's hand shot out, her grip surprisingly strong. Her claws were retracted, but he could feel their presence, a reminder of the predator beneath the magistrate. I am Shi Velses, High Magistrate of the Felinar Sovereignty's Colonial Affairs Council. You have saved my life and the lives of my children. In my culture, this makes you a Watergiver. There is no higher honor. There is no greater debt. No debt, Jake said quickly, trying to pull his hand back. I just couldn't let kids die. That's all. Even as he said it, he knew it was a lie. It was never just about the cubs. It was about the 63 colonists. It was about one last, desperate chance to prove that his hands could give life instead of taking it. She sat up, wincing, and gathered her cubs close. They nuzzled against her, but Cass kept looking back at Jake, his golden eyes filled with an unwavering, innocent trust. The Watergiver does not yet understand the bond he has forged, she murmured, her gaze sharp, analytical, and fixed on Jake's face. But he will. That was when the world ended for the second time in Jake's life. The compound's proximity sensors screamed a piercing, high-pitched wail. 4 vehicles approaching fast from the south, the automated voice announced. On the main display, 4 heat signatures resolved into dune crawlers, each mounted with pulse cannons. 12 hostiles armed and moving with cold military precision. Jake's blood turned to ice as the lead vehicle's identification beacon flashed on his screen. The personal insignia of Vex Terran, the warlord who held a bloody monopoly on every drop of water across the northern continent. They found us, she whispered, her voice devoid of panic, replaced by a steely resolve. She looked at her cubs, then back at Jake. He wants us dead. We are witnesses to his crimes, to a conspiracy that stretches across star systems. By saving us, Watergiver, you have declared yourself his enemy. Jake stared at the approaching icons of death, then at the alien family huddled in the heart of his sanctuary. 3 years of hiding, 3 years of running from responsibility. Over. He ripped his pulse rifle from its wall rack, his hands moving with the muscle memory of his 8 years in the Colonial Engineering Corps. He'd built fortifications on a dozen worlds before he'd built a tomb on one. How long until they're in firing range? She asked, her voice now sharp with command. 4 minutes. Maybe 5 if they're cautious, Jake replied, already pulling up the compound's pathetic defense grid. They won't be cautious, she said, struggling to her feet. Vex wants this buried. Do you have other weapons? I may be a magistrate, but I was trained in the combat protocols of my house. Jake looked at this regal woman, ready to fight for her children despite being on the verge of collapse. He looked at Kes and Mira, their eyes wide with a fear they were too young to comprehend. He had failed 63 colonists because of a miscalculation, because he had trusted his own genius too much. Here now, failure was not a variable. It was an impossibility. "Yeah," Jake said, tossing her a plasma pistol and yanking open a locker filled with his old mining equipment. "I've got weapons, and I've got a plan." He gave her a grim smile. "It's probably going to destroy my entire compound. It's definitely going to make Vex want my head on a pike. And it might just get us all killed." She checked the pistol's charge with practiced efficiency, a fierce feral smile revealing her delicate fangs. "Then it sounds like a proper Felinar welcome party. I accept your protection, Watergiver. And when we survive, I will explain why you and I are now bound by a fate you cannot begin to imagine." The first pulse cannon shot slammed against the outer wall, and the war for their survival and for Jake Reeves' soul had begun. The compound shrieked as pulse rifle fire hammered its reinforced walls. Shy shielded her cubs, but Jake was already a blur of motion. The haunted surveyor was gone, replaced by the cold, efficient soldier he had tried so hard to bury. He ripped open a locker, his hands a flurry of movement as he repurposed seismic survey charges, stripping wires, rigging detonators with a terrifying, familiar ease. "Get the cubs to the transport." "Now!" he barked. She didn't question him. She herded Kes and Mira toward his battered land transport in the garage, her plasma pistol held steady. Jake sprinted through the compound, slapping the explosive charges onto the primary support struts of the outer wall, the very wall the attackers were using for cover. He set the timer for 10 seconds and dove into the driver's seat, just as she bundled the cubs inside. He floored the accelerator, ramming the transport through the garage's rear blast door as a series of deafening explosions tore his world apart behind them. The entire outer wall collapsed outward in a tidal wave of steel and rockcrete, burying the lead dune crawler and sending Vex's men scrambling. As they rocketed away into the desert night, the compound that had been Jake's prison for 3 years burned behind them, a funeral pyre for the ghost he used to be. He glanced in the rear-view display. She's golden eyes were fixed on him, filled not with fear but with a startling awe. He felt a tug on his jacket and looked down. Both cubs, Kes and Mira, were clinging to him, their small bodies trembling. He was no longer just a man who had given them water. He was their shield. Hours later, the adrenaline wore off, replaced by the grim reality. They were in the middle of a wasteland, with a warlord's army hunting them and a 3-day journey to the capital. Prism Falls. Jake pulled the transport into the shadow of a towering rock spire to conserve energy. He turned to the cubs. "Time for a lesson." He grabbed a canteen and a knife, pointing to a gnarled, barrel-shaped cactus. "This is a giver's pod. It holds water, but you have to know how to get it." He sliced a precise notch near the base, letting a trickle of thick, clear liquid seep out. Kes, ever the bold one, immediately hopped out and began clumsily mimicking the motion on another cactus with his claws. A genuine smile touched Jake's lips for the first time in years. As he knelt to show Kes the proper technique, a small, cool hand brushed against his. He froze. A jolt, not of electricity but of pure emotion, shot up his arm. A wave of crippling shyness, a deep, primal fear of the vast, empty desert. He looked down. Mira, the quiet one, had reached for him, her golden eyes wide with apology. He gently closed his hand over hers. "It's okay," he whispered, pushing a feeling of calm reassurance back at her. The wave of anxiety receded, replaced by a flicker of surprised gratitude. Shy watched them, a soft warmth in her gaze. "In our culture," she said, her voice quiet but clear over the wind, A Watergiver is not just one who shares a resource. It is one who shares life itself. It is the most revered title. She looked out at the wasteland. My mate. He died 2 years ago defending a human colony from raiders. He was a Watergiver, too. The confession hung in the air, a bridge of shared loss between them. The words felt like rust in Jake's mouth, but he spoke them anyway. I ran a terraforming project on Kepler 9, promised families a new start. My calculations were off by 0.003%. The atmospheric processors failed catastrophically. He didn't need to say more. The guilt was a physical thing he wore like a shroud. She's gaze was unsettlingly direct, holding no trace of judgment. Water remembers no mistakes, she said softly, her golden eyes seeming to see right through the walls he'd built. Only the direction it flows now. That night they took turns on watch. The twin moons of Aritus cast long skeletal shadows across the dunes. As Jake scanned the horizon, he felt a subtle shift beside him. She, exhausted, leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder. Her fur was cool against his skin, and he could feel a low, soft purr vibrating through her body into his. He knew instinctively this wasn't a gesture of romance. It was something far deeper. It was an act of profound, absolute trust, a silent declaration. He didn't move. He just sat there under the alien stars, a shield for his new pride. The Mirage Oasis was a shimmering dome of recycled moisture and flickering neon, a pocket of civilization in an ocean of sand. But as they approached, Jake's eyes narrowed. Perched atop a cargo hauler was a drone, small and insect-like, its lens swiveling with cold precision. Stenciled on the hauler's side was the twin sigil of Vex Terran. They hadn't shaken their pursuers. They'd walked right into their web. Stay close, he muttered. Inside, as she haggled for water rations, an elderly Felinar merchant with a scarred face leaned close, his voice a frantic whisper. High Magistrate, you must leave. The bounty isn't just from the warlord. He glanced around nervously. It's been sanctioned. Sovereignty Security Chief Morak himself has declared you a fugitive. The price on your head could buy a moon. The blood drained from Shi's face. Morak. The conspiracy reached the highest levels of her own government. Before she could react, a voice, metallic and cruel, cut through the market chatter. The fugitive and her human pet. Vex Terran sends his regards. A figure stepped from the shadows, blocking their only exit. He was Crash, a hulking reptilian species, but half his body was a nightmarish fusion of chrome and steel. One arm was a plasma cannon, his eye a glowing red optic. Scar, Vex's infamous bounty hunter. A kill squad materialized behind him. Panic erupted. Scar raised his weapon. Jake didn't think. He grabbed Shi and the cubs, shoving them behind a stall as plasma bolts melted the spot where they'd stood. He saw it then, the central control panel for the Oasis's entire irrigation network. A desperate, insane idea sparked. Yelling, "Hold on!" He fired a single precise shot into the panel. With a deafening groan, pressurized pipes burst overhead. A tidal wave of water crashed down, flooding the market, dousing lanterns and creating pure, unadulterated chaos. Scar roared as the deluge shorted out his cybernetics. In the confusion, Jake dragged his family through the rushing water and out a side maintenance hatch. As they scrambled into the transport, Scar's voice, distorted and full of hate, crackled over their comms. "The cubs will die slow, human, and you'll watch." In that moment, something primal ignited in Jake. This wasn't a job. They weren't charges. They were his family. And he would burn the galaxy down to keep them safe. That night, in the skeleton of a long-dead city, she revealed everything. The assassins took my guards, my ship, but they didn't know where I kept the evidence. She placed her palm on Kess's flank, then Mira's. A soft golden light pulsed from her hand, and a holographic display shimmered into existence between them. The files were woven directly into her children's genetic markers. A living lockbox. The truth spilled out. Schematics for illegal deep-core drilling rigs. Planetary scans showing aquifers the size of oceans being siphoned dry. The term appeared again and again. Aqua Prime, a rare, hyperdense water isotope. It's used in next-generation plasma cannons and starship shielding. She's voice was cold steel. Vex and Security Chief Morak aren't just stealing water. They're mining a weapons component. The display shifted. Jake saw images of 4 colony worlds, once green, now barren. He saw the faces of millions of refugees. The parallels to Kepler 9 hit him like a physical blow. He had failed one world. These men were murdering entire systems. Then came the final file. Encrypted transmission logs between Vex Terran and a name that made Jake's blood run cold. The Hegemony, humanity's oldest and most bitter rival. They were arming the enemy. This was no longer about a bounty. It was about preventing a war that would slaughter billions. The guilt he'd carried, the weight of the 63, it was no longer a ghost to run from. It was a lesson to be acted upon. She's golden eyes found his. She reached out, her cool fingers wrapping around his scarred hands. Will you stand with us? Not as a bodyguard I hired, but as pridekin, as family. Jake's gaze fell to the sleeping cubs, the source of all this chaos, and the reason he finally felt a purpose again. He tightened his grip on her hands, his voice an unbreakable vow. Yes, that night a furious sandstorm forced them deep into the ancient ruins. The wind screamed, but inside their shelter a fragile quiet held sway. She came to him, the dust of ages on her shoulders. Among my people, she murmured beneath the storm. When 2 souls are bound by a water debt as great as ours, we share more than a watch. We share our truth. Before he could answer, she raised her hands, cupped his face, and pressed her forehead to his. The world dissolved. It was a flood. He felt her searing grief for a lost mate, the crushing loneliness of her position, the supernova bright love for her children. And then he felt himself through her senses. He felt his own human heat not as temperature, but as a grounding warmth she craved. He saw his hands not as tools of failure, but as the gentle hands that had saved her cubs. To her, he wasn't a ghost running from his past. He was a bastion of quiet strength. The connection snapped. They both gasped, breathless. I haven't felt this, Jake started, his voice rough. This alive in years. She's eyes were glistening. He closed the distance, and their kiss was a collision of desperation and discovery. A sleepy chirp broke the moment. Mira, her large eyes blinking, padded over and nudged her head firmly against Jake's side, tugging him down towards their sleeping pile. Kes shifted, making room. Jake lay down, a cub on either side, she settling beside him, her head on his shoulder. The storm raged, but in the heart of the ruins, sheltered by stone and fir, Jake was no longer a survivor. He was home. The storm passed. Jake, using an old, hardened comm unit, keyed in a frequency he hadn't used in 3 years. Reeves, a gravelly voice crackled. I know you only call when the sky is falling. It was Captain Thess, a freighter pilot whose life Jake had once saved. He explained everything. It's worse than you think, Jake, she rasped. Vex's operation. I've been running economic relocations for months. Entire colonies packed up as their worlds dry up. They're told it's climate collapse. It's planetary scale murder. Then came the gut punch. There's someone else who tried to blow the whistle. Your old CO, Colonel Vaughn. He's here on Aritus. A disgraced ghost, just like you. The meeting was in the belly of a derelict cargo hauler. Colonel Vaughn looked like a man carved from bitterness. Well, well, Jake Reeves, he mocked. Heard you'd gone native. She stepped forward, her regal bearing unshakable. Colonel, we are not his charges. We are his pride, she projected the files. Vaughn's mockery died. He saw the data, the treason. He saw the way Jake stood by Shy, the trust in her eyes, the devotion in his. I have a network, Vaughn said, his voice a conspirator's whisper. Loyalists Morak ruined. We can get into the Capitol, broadcast this during the council session. But we'll never get close unless we pull their attention. All eyes turned to Jake. A plan sparked, cold and tactical. We don't go for the Capitol, Jake said, a new authority in his voice. We go for the source. We're going to hit Vex's primary drilling site. While I create a fire, your team will bring the flood. The Aqua Prime drilling complex rose from the canyons like a metal spine. Jake, moving with the quiet efficiency of his engineering corps days, planted the last of the seismic charges. Above him, she moved like a liquid shadow, a silent, lethal predator defending her territory. Jake hit the detonator. The canyon shuddered. The massive drill tower groaned and collapsed inward. A colossal geyser of shimmering Aqua Prime erupted into the night. But their cheers died as floodlights snapped on. Vex's voice boomed from loudspeakers. A fine show, Magistrate. A truly spectacular act of terrorism. Vex's enforcers swarmed them. The bounty hunter Scar moved with terrifying speed, disarming Thess before she could react. They were herded onto a high platform, trapped. My associate security chief Morak is addressing the council as we speak, Vex gloated, presenting this attack as the final, irrefutable proof of your treason. Once they authorize lethal force, my first targets will be the two little cubs hiding in the desert. A guttural roar of pure maternal fury tore from Shy's throat. She tensed to launch herself at him, a suicidal charge, but Jake's hand shot out, gripping her arm. His voice was ice. You just don't get it, do you? He said, a grim, humorless smile on his face. You think this was the main event? While you were watching the fireworks, our people were walking right through your front door. Vex threw his head back and laughed, but his laughter was cut short by a frantic burst of static from his comm unit. Sir, breach! Sovereignty Council chambers. Unauthorized broadcast! On the platform's view screen, Vex's smug face was replaced by the panicked image of Security Chief Morak. His denials were drowned out by a flood of data, the very files from the Cubs' DNA. The face of the old Oasis merchant appeared, his voice ringing with authority. The evidence is irrefutable. Then came the final twist, decoded hegemony communications. Morak wasn't just corrupt. He was a sleeper agent. His entire operation was engineered to shatter the Felinar-human alliance and leave both vulnerable to a hegemony invasion. The blood drained from Vex's face. He wasn't a partner. He was a pawn. Seeing his employer's empire implode, Scar made a simple calculation. He disabled the guards holding Thess and shoved her back towards Jake. My contract with Vex is terminated, the cyborg stated flatly. But Morak, cornered and exposed, made his last move. An alert flashed across the screen. Unauthorized orbital strike protocol activated. If I am to be undone, I will burn the board! His voice crackled, laced with insane fury. Countdown timers appeared. Targets, the drilling complex and Prism Falls itself. Annihilation was minutes away. The orbital control relay had to be inside Vex's fortress. Jake grabbed Shee's hand and they plunged into the chaos. Plasma bolts hissed past their heads as they moved as one, a whirlwind of human tactics and Felinar ferocity. A guard rounded a corner. Before Jake could react, she threw herself in front of him. The plasma blast hit her shoulder with a sickening sizzle. She cried out, clutching the smoking wound. Cold, absolute rage flooded Jake. He dispatched the guard and was at her side. No time for a med kit. He grabbed a maintenance torch, ignited it, and met her wide, trusting golden eyes. He pressed the searing metal to her flesh. She didn't scream. Her gaze held his, a silent vow passing between them. He pulled her to her feet, and they ran. They burst into the central command spire just as the screen flashed. Orbital strike in T-minus 60 seconds. Vex stood before the console, his face a mask of broken pride. "If I can't have this world," he snarled, raising a pistol, "no one can." Jake charged, a raw roar tearing from his throat, the ghosts of 63 colonists roaring with him. Vex fired, but Jake moved through the pain, tackling the warlord. "I couldn't save them then," Jake bellowed, years of guilt fueling his fists. "But I'll be damned if I fail now." While Jake overpowered the broken man, she stumbled to the console, one arm useless. Her claws flew across the interface, her magistrate security codes flashing on the screen. Abort sequence initiated. Override requires magistrate confirmation. To minus 10 seconds. Her hand trembled as she entered the final command. With an echoing chime, the orbital platforms powered down. It was over. The High Council chamber in Prism Falls was a cathedral of light. Jake stood beside Shah, feeling out of place in his battered surveyor's jacket. Kess and Mira clung to his legs. Colonel Vaughn, his record cleared, gave a curt, respectful nod. She, her arm in a sleek medical sling, addressed the assembly, laying out the entire conspiracy. The verdict was swift. The council not only exonerated her, but elevated her. "We name you High Magistrate of Colonial Affairs," the lead counselor declared. Applause thundered through the hall. "I accept," she said, her golden eyes finding Jake. "On one condition. My first appointment will be a human liaison for water rights and colonial protection. A man whose engineering expertise and moral clarity have already saved millions. I name Jake Reeves. The titles, the politics, they all faded into a distant hum. All that mattered were the two small bodies pressed against him. He knelt, ignoring the stares of 100 officials, and pulled Kess and Mira into a fierce hug, burying his face in their soft fur. Kess, the brave one, pushed back just enough to look him in the eye. In a clumsy, halting voice mixing Felinar chirps with newly learned human words, the cub spoke. "Pride, father." Mira, her shy telepathic touch brushing his mind with pure, unvarnished love, echoed the word aloud. "Pride, father." The sound shattered the last of the ice around Jake's heart. He looked up at Shy, his vision blurring. "You gave us water when we were dying," she whispered. "For him alone. Now you've given us a future." 8 months later, the twin sons of Aritus no longer baked the earth. They warmed it. A sea of green gold grass rippled in the breeze, flowing down to the banks of a clear, bubbling stream, the first reclaimed aquifer, breathing life back into the planet, thanks to a system Jake had designed. He stood on the porch of their home, a structure of curved Felinar lines and sturdy human engineering, and watched the future unfold. Kess and Mira, now lanky adolescents, raced through the grasslands, their joyous chirps echoing in the open air. Shy joined him, her hand resting on the gentle curve of her belly, a promise of a life that would be a living bridge between their worlds. Jake had spent years hiding in the desert, convinced he only brought disaster. Yet in choosing to save them, he had saved himself. The guilt had transformed into purpose. A glint in the sky announced Captain Thess's freighter, bringing supplies and news from a galaxy at peace. As the suns dipped below the horizon, casting their family in a silhouette of deep purples and fiery orange, Jake wrapped his arm around Shy, pulling her close as the cubs bounded back up the hill to complete their circle. He was finally home, part of an unbreakable pride, forged in fire and bound by the water that had given them all a second chance. The story of this pride is just beginning. Vex and Morak were pawns, but the hegemony is still out there, and they never forget. If you want to see how Jake and Shy protect their growing family against a new galactic threat, make sure you smash that like button, subscribe, and ring that notification bell so you don't miss the next chapter. And let me know in the comments below, what would you name their new child? The first of their kind. Until next time, stay vigilant.